the dust may be settling now that the Western Cape taxi strike has been called off, and the Provincial Education Department says a full week of teaching and learning was lost for many pupils. So are there any catch-up plans? For more on this, I'm joined by the Western Cape Education spokesperson, Kerry Mauchline. Thank you so much, Kerry, for joining me this evening. This taxi strike obviously had a devastating impact on so many different departments and industries, but schools especially as well. Thousands of learners not being able to attend school for a few days. How has this strike basically impacted the education sector in the Western Cape?
Good evening to you. Yes, unfortunately, it has been a very difficult week for our schools and for our department. So many learners staying at home at one stage on Tuesday, I think because of what had happened on Monday and the amount of rumors and fake news that was going around. We had over 800,000 learners that stayed home and nearly 18,000 staff members. So certainly that has had a huge impact on our schools, considering that's about 71% of our learners. And at the moment, we're already trying to catch up from lost time during the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's really not something we can afford at this point. But it's understandable that parents in this situation would keep their kids home, even if they weren't in areas that were directly affected by a lack of transport.
Of course, we heard earlier now, I don't know if you were listening to the bulletin when I started, Santaku, of course, there are still concerns that, taxis are still being impounded. Of course, if somebody's watching this and they're listening to what's going on, as a parent, you might be a little bit scared to send your kid to school come tomorrow. What do you have to say to those parents, and what kind of reassurance can you give them to make sure that the kids go to school tomorrow?
Look, I think we saw on Friday, obviously because the strike was called off really late on Thursday evening, we still didn't see much by way of attendance on Friday, although it had improved quite significantly. And I really can understand the position that parents are in. I too can see how it would be quite scary to send your kids back to school. But certainly I think with the assurances that we've seen and with the resumption of somewhat normal services over the weekend, I do think that we can encourage parents to send their kids back to school. And certainly that's not just in order to catch up lost teaching and learning time. We know that schools are so much more than that. Our schools are places of safety for our children. They are very important for learners who are in vulnerable communities in terms of their nutrition, because they served 2 meals at school as well. So we'd really encourage them to send their kids back to school, obviously making a call for their particular area. But I think the key thing that was hugely problematic last week, certainly I spent most of my week dealing with rumors and with fake news. Always make sure to verify with your school what the actual situation is on the ground. We had plenty of claims on social media that School X was on fire, and I mean, we had circuit managers literally standing outside the school saying, no, I'm here, it's not. So I think it's very, very important to check in with their principal, check in with their child's teacher, but most importantly, we need to get kids back to class now.
Yeah, because it's easy to believe certain WhatsApp messages and Facebook messages going around to scare off parents and pupils at schools. Let's maybe, take it into perspective here, how this absenteeism will affect the overall calendar, the school calendar, if at all.
Well, certainly we are in a bit of a unique situation given the length of the strike. We had a major one last year, but that only lasted a day, and we also had a very large number of learners that were absent on that day. But one day is less of an issue than an entire week. I would like to think that this is the first time our schools have experienced it, but it's actually not. We had a couple of communities earlier this year that had learners not at school for 3 weeks because of a blockade of learner transport by taxi associations. I mean, at one stage they said even parents couldn't take kids to school in their own cars. So we have had this happen in our schools before. And the thing is that you'll have in one class, you might have 5 kids who are absent, in another class, 30. Some of them may have been absent for one day, some of them may have been absent for the entire week. So what our teachers generally do is do an assessment just to see what kind of learning losses have occurred over the period. And then if they need additional time or additional resources, then they do reach out to us and we can provide that support.
And like you said, you mentioned it earlier as well, it's always the most vulnerable of communities that suffer the most when it comes to this. Maybe just your take on that as well.
Absolutely. And as you know, in the Western Cape, we've launched a 1.2 billion rand Back on Track program to catch up on learning losses during the pandemic. And those are targeted specifically to those communities that were most severely affected, the communities where online learning or learning from home is not really practical. And unfortunately, it's the same communities that have been hit again. And I think it's really crucial that when these kinds of decisions are made, when strike action occurs like this, our key consideration, and it's well spelled out in the Children's Act, is the best interests of our children. And we need to make sure that whatever we do, we are not impacting their ability to access their constitutional right to basic education.
Thank you so much. Kerry Mauchline, just giving us an update on the impacts the taxi strike has had on the education department or the education sector basically in the Western Cape, and schools and learners. Of course, parents and learners are concerned that the taxi strike, could still have an impact in some way